Chapter 39. Sanders turned off the highway at Mr. Wellington's road, drove into the forest, and stopped. He got out and went around to the back of the car. I heard him open and close the trunk. When he opened my door, he held the dog collar on a chain. He grabbed my ear, and I gritted my teeth as he pulled me across the seat. "Just like a dog, boy," he mumbled as he fastened the collar around my neck. "That too tight?" I didn't answer. He pulled the collar a notch tighter and pinched my skin in the buckle. "I'll hang you 3 feet off the ground with this thing if you try something funny." Sanders removed my ankle cuffs and jerked me to my feet. He draped a canteen of water around my neck, then shoved me forward. "Get on," he said. We followed a trail of new orange flagging tape tied to trees around about every 20 yards. I walked slowly in front of my mind, imagining my escape and building traps and weapons. I went through all the tools at the shelter and tried to remember where I had last seen them. I listened to Sanders behind me and gauged his energy by the sound of his footsteps and his breathing. He was tired after we climbed the first hill, but he got his energy back when we started through the flat pine forest. Once we came to Sholmo Creek, he rested against a tree for a few minutes. Then he jerked my leash. I knew it was time to move on again. After we had traveled about a mile, Sanders yanked the leash so hard that I coughed against it. A sharp pain shot up in my head, and I gritted my teeth again. "Give me some water," he said. Usually the forest worked with me. The sounds of the animals and the light patterns in the breezes carrying smell told me what it knew. That day, though, it seemed the forest had forgotten about me. It did nothing to help me. The animal sounds were distant and muffled. The sunlight lay in large, still blocks. There was no breeze. All that lay before me were endless hills of pine and swampy cane bottoms. As I realized this, my head grew dizzy. My thoughts wouldn't get straight. I couldn't remember what I had decided to do about Sanders. All I put together from my memory of the old shelter was a ruin of strewn logs and scattered cooking utensils. Suddenly, I felt that Sanders was going to kill me and leave me to rot. I thought of Kit. I thought of what Sanders would do to him after I was dead. I thought of dying and remembered what Pap said about not feeling pain when you died. I thought of Kit again. I thought of hell. I had not said goodbye to either of them, my only friends. I rushed against the leash and felt it jerk me backwards until I lay flat on the leaves. Sanders laughed over me. He said something I couldn't make out, and I was lifted up by the collar. Even though I coughed and gagged, it didn't hurt. He draped the canteen over me, and I began to walk. I trudged on through more hills and valleys, stopped for Sanders to rest every time the leash was jerked. Eventually, sunlight fell over me, and I was standing in the clearing with the ruined shelter before me. I had no plan. I couldn't even think of what to tell Sanders. I turned around slowly to face him. He was putting Copenhagen in his lip and breathing hard. He packed the tobacco with his tongue while his mouth hung open and gasped for air. Then he flicked the excess from his fingers and looked at me. "Give me that water again." I pulled the canteen off my neck and held it out to him. He snatched it, swirled off the top, and took a long drink. Then he let it down. He said, "Ah, bet you like some of this, wouldn't you?" I didn't answer. My throat was dry, but bigger problems worried me. He dropped the canteen to the ground and wiped his hand across his forehead. "Well, let's see it," he said. "I don't have to. You don't have what?" "I don't have it." "You don't have what?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't have it." "You don't have what?" he yelled. I felt my body snag like it was waiting to fall on the ground, and whatever Sanders was about to bring down on me, suddenly I heard a voice. "What's going on here?" Mr. Wellington had come up the trail behind us. Sanders immediately loosened his grip on the chain and spun around to face the lawyer. "You just mind your own business and go back to your fancy lodge. What are you doing to that child?" "Business, police business. Will be done shortly." Mr. Wellington looked at me and then back at Sanders. "What kind of police business requires a dog leash?" Sanders' face was turning red. "Mister, I suggest you take your lawyer and back down that trail before I rate you up for obstructing justice." Mr. Wellington stared at Sanders. "Obstructing justice, you say?" "That's right." Mr. Wellington studied the ground and shook his head. He looked up slowly and his face became calm. "Constable, do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Sanders' hands began to twitch with anger. He dropped the leash and took a step towards the lawyer. "You want to play that game, old man? You want to play who's who in the Sumter County? That what you want?" The chain was on the ground a few seconds before my senses came rushing back to me. I shouted out the rest of their conversation and focused on the limp chain lying in the leaves. With a quick yank, I had it flying through the air and gathered at my stomach. Clutching it around my chest with my hands still in handcuffs, I sprinted for the edge of the clearing. I heard yelling and footfalls behind me as I sprang into the forest. I ran until it seemed like everything around me was quiet. It might have been 200 yards or it might have been a mile. I don't know where I was anymore. When I lay down and let the chain fall back into the leaves, I didn't feel tired. All I heard was my breathing and my heart beating. The treetops overhead were still and the sky was overcast. The forest was endless in all directions. It seemed to stretch out forever with no people. It seemed full of animals that turned their heads away from me and spoke about me in whispers. All I thought about was the fact that I was still alive, and it no longer seemed to matter. Everybody cared about was in trouble because of me. Chapter 40. The clouds slid over my upturned eyes the rest of the afternoon. Just before sunset, the sky cleared and buzzards circled me. You might just want me this time, I said. As the forest grayed, a coon waddled up in the leash chain and pawed it. When I stood, it scampered away in surprise. I took off the leash and felt my neck where there was a ring of swollen skin. Looking at my wrists, I saw where the handcuffs had worn me raw enough to bleed in places. I rolled over a nearby log and gathered some slugs. By rubbing their slime on my wrists, I made them slippery enough to pull out of the handcuffs. Using the stars, I got my bearings and set out through the forest. In 45 minutes, I was staring at the windows of Mr. Wellington's lodge. I watched until I saw him get up from a chair and walk into the kitchen. He came back shortly with a drink and sat down. I stepped from the forest and approached his door. He opened the door before I could knock and stared down at me like he'd been expecting me a long time before. What do you plan on doing now? He asked me. I'm ready for the law to come get me and take me back to jail. The last I saw of the law, he was chasing you through the forest. I stared at Mr. Wellington blankly. Come on, he said, motioning me for me to step inside. Mr. Wellington pointed me for me to sit on the sofa, and he sat across from me in the chair. The clock ticked over his fireplace, and moss thumped against the window screens. I'll take you in the morning, he said. I nodded and looked down at my knees. That constable's got problems. I've encountered men like him before. We don't need to be around him. You don't need to be around him. You won't let me alone. Mr. Wellington picked up the drink he'd left on the table and took a sip. He set it back down, and I felt him studying me. Did you do all the things he said you did? I didn't do the part about eating the dogs and shooting at him. Why would he make up things like that? I whipped up on him a couple of times. Maybe that's why. What does that mean? It means I licked him. Mr. Wellington scratched his chin. You licked him, huh? He wouldn't let me alone. But you didn't shoot at him or eat his dogs? No, sir. Where are the dogs? At my friend's house. He lives near a place called Union at a clay pit. Is this the other boy who escaped with you? Yes, sir. How about the gun? Which one? Whichever one he thinks you shot at him with. I left it in the forest. Out there where he had you today? No, that's where I told him it was. I lied. Mr. Wellington sat forward in his chair. He wanted you to get it for him? I nodded. Why would he want it so bad? 'Cause it's his, I guess. I wish he'd give me back the gun he took from me. Mr. Wellington sat back and chuckled to himself. First of all, kid, they can't put you in jail, at least not for long. You're too young. I don't know what Sanders has planned for you, but he's been getting the general public riled up about you for some time now. I've got a feeling I know what he's got planned for me. Well, I've been a lawyer long enough to know that his legal options are limited. However, this is not your typical situation. His father happens to be the judge. That can be complicated things. That can complicate things. The Sanders fellow is a bully and a bigot. He's got a chip on his shoulder that's probably been there since he was a child. He's unintelligent and he's mean, and he's in a position of power. That's a bad combination to be facing. I didn't reply. Not to mention that you seem to have caused irreparable damage to his pride. What's that mean? It means you're going to need some help. I don't need help from anybody. He can't do anything to me that I care about. He is going to go after Kit if he doesn't get his hands on me. Mr. Wellington sighed and stood up. He walked into the kitchen and I heard him turn on the faucet. When he returned, he held out a glass of water to me. I took it and he sat back down in his chair. You know why I came after you today? No, sir. I feel responsible for a lot of what's gone on with you. I'm not going to stand for that constable and his ways, especially on my property. I never thought it would turn out like this. How'd you know I was out there? The chime sounded that lets me know somebody's coming up my road. When no one showed, I drove out and found Sanders' car. I figured he was up to no good when I saw your footprints with his. I was quiet for a minute. Finally, I said, You lied to me. Every grown person I know has lied to me except Mr. Mitchell and Obregon and Mr. Carter. You're right, even though it wasn't a technical lie, I lied to you all the same. I'm sorry about that. I was lonely. I'd have gone away if you'd wanted. I know, the first thing that came in my mind wasn't the right choice. I could have talked to you and I could have been your friend. Yes, sir. I've got too much money. I thought I could buy my way above the general human condition. But when you get old and retire and live alone, you realize you're not any different. Sometimes you're worse off. Worse off. I don't know about any of that. Mr. Wellington nodded to himself. That's all right. You know, I've been following your story on the television and in the papers. I've defended enough criminals to know a little about character. I had my doubts all along that you were all they said you were. I give them feisty and hard to hold, but not the other things Davy Sanders is putting on you. I already told you he lied. I'm going to help you, Moon, and it's not just for your sake, but for my own as well. You might just go along with me because I don't see you've got anything to lose. I don't care what you do, I said. Then why don't you go into the bathroom and clean up while I fix you a sandwich? Then we can get some sleep in the guest room. We've got a big day ahead of us.